Bana Kia.
Should I go ahead and start? Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Mindy Cahoon, and I'm a PhD student in the Interdisciplinary Near and Middle Eastern Studies program at the University of Washington. I'm here to thank you all for coming to today's conversation with Professor Mana Kia about her first book, Persianate Selves. This workshop seminar is part of the Persian Studies Workshop Series hosted by the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization. After a series of introductions, we will then turn to Mana's presentation, followed by Mana, Salim, and Arya's conversation, and lastly, a Q&A section. During the Q&A, I will ask any of you if you may have questions to type it in the Q&A interface. Depending on whether we can unmute you, we might be able to have you ask them yourselves. I am now going to turn to Salim's introduction. It is now my pleasure to introduce Associate Professor Salim Kuru, Chair of the Near Eastern Languages and Civilization Department and Director of Turkish and Ottoman Studies Program. Salim is a historian of Western Turkish literature and literary culture who is trained as a philologist. His interests include formulations of gender in Ottoman and modern Turkish literatures, literary circles, and literary competition in Anatolian Turkic city-states and the Ottoman Empire. Currently, Salim's research tackles issues of gender and racialization in Ottoman literary texts with a focus on the place of literary production in the lives of Ottoman political elite and intellectuals. I will now hand over the platform to Salim.
Hello, everyone. After a year of Zooming, I'm still having trouble unmuting myself. I have a muted existence, I guess. And I would like to welcome all of you to this brilliant event with Professor Mana Kia. I am thankful to her for accepting our invitation for this conversation. This event is possible thanks to our puppet master. You may not be able to see him, but Patrick Gibbs is behind all this webinar and controlling who can be seen, who can talk, who should shut up as well. So Patrick is our Near Eastern Language and Civilization administrator. Him and our administrative staff, Rick Aguilar, worked for this organization. I would also like to thank our faculty Sherzad Shams as a member of Persian and Iranian Studies program hosted by our department. And also I would like to thank our co-sponsor, South Asia Center. Since I have become the director of Persian and Iranian Studies in 2015, I have been blessed by the support of my colleagues and units at the University of Washington and by the inimitable Seattle Persian communities. Their continuing support enables us to realize these events. They are the June of this program. Last but not least, I am thankful to my colleague this year, my co-director of the Persian and Iranian Studies program, and next year he will be the director of this program, Professor Arya Fani, for organizing this event. It's a pleasure for me to introduce Arya briefly so that he can introduce Professor Kia. Arya joined NALC last year after receiving his PhD degree from University of Berkeley with his dissertation titled Becoming Literature, the Formation of Edebiyat as an Academic Discipline in Iran and Afghanistan. This year, he is named the Elahe Omidyar Mirjalali Professor of Persian and Iranian Studies, thanks to a generous endowment by Roshan Heritage Institute. Arya has already developed a new curriculum for the NALC's Persian and Iranian Studies program and became a very popular instructor with the courses he offered so far. He also published two articles, one on Zokaul Mulk, Forugi, forgive my Persian, and literary history, and the other on Shafi'i Kadgani about untranslatability. Literary history and translation are two fields Arya's work focuses on. He's currently working on his book project, which is titled Making Persian Literature, Iran and Afghanistan in the Age of Romantic Nationalism. His work is framed by a larger question, reconsideration and recirculation of classical Persian literature in the making of national institution of literature. I also would like to congratulate Arya for the Royalty Research Award, Fund Award that he received this year to work on his project during the spring quarter. Uh, Before leaving the floor to Arya, I will let you know that after Arya's introduction, myself and Arya will ask some questions to our guest, Professor Kia, and then we will open the floor as Mindy described before for your questions. Thank you, Arya.
Well, good day, everybody. I am deeply honored and delighted to introduce my good colleague, Professor Mana Kiao. I first met Mana in a conference organized by our mutual friend and colleague, Alexander Jabbari at UCI. I think it was 2018. And I have seen her give numerous presentations since then at UC Berkeley, if I'm not mistaken, Tbilisi perhaps, various conferences. And it was very clear, the impression I had of her work back in 2018 was that Mana is a scholar that is invested in questioning the received wisdom of the field and reconceptualizing according to what she sees are the analytical needs of both Iranian studies and South Asia and South Asian studies. Mana is an associate professor in the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies. And the reason we are here today is because her book, much anticipated study titled Persianate Selves, Memories of Place and Origin Before Nationalism, has been out. It's received already a warm reception and has generated a lot of dialogue. And before I give the floor to Mana, I also like to say that something that you're not going to come across in her biographical descriptions online is that Mana is an extremely generous interlocutor, especially to the younger generation, people that are junior to her. She has been extremely generous towards me. We've been in dialogue about a number of issues that overlap in our work. And also, I'd like to mention two titles among her long list of publications that are more recent. One is titled The Necessary Ornaments of Place, Similarity and Alterity in the Persianate Imaginary, that came out in Comparative Islamic Studies, and a special issue that has been a source of inspiration to me in thinking about the ways in which the Persianate pasts have been deployed to create national presence, is an article entitled Indian Friends, Iranian Selves, Persianate Modern, that came out in a special issue she co-edited with Afshin Marashi in the Journal of Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Mana, I virtually welcome you to the University of Washington.
Thank you, Adia. That's very kind of you. And I wanted to thank Adia, Salim, for the invitation to speak here today, and to the Persian and Iranian Studies program housed in NELC, and to the South Asia Center. I'm just sorry I couldn't return to campus, given that I was about 20 years ago an employee of University of Washington at the Jackson School, way back when. So I'm going to share my screen. And it's not supposed to be here. There we go. All right, so you can all see this. This is the cover of the book. Yes, okay, good. So I'm gonna speak for about 20 minutes, and I'm gonna address a number of points. Kind of thinking about, explaining a little bit about how I came to this project, giving you an outline of the book, and here's the cover. And then I'm also gonna talk a little bit about the approaches of reading, the approaches to my sources in reading and in interpreting meaning, and what kinds of interventions they may pose. And I'm happy to kind of speak more about the field in general in the course of our discussion. So put simply, I came to this project first because of a basic sense of incommensurability. Something wasn't lining up between the fact that we've been told by a sort of body of recent scholarship over the last 2-3 decades about how nationalism is a particular development of modernity. And the way in which there's a kind of incommensurability between that and the prevalence of nationalist understandings of the periods before, all periods before, including what it meant to be from Iran or a Persian speaker not from Iran, in the many centuries when Persian was not a term that could be made interchangeable with Iran. And so let me back up for a minute and give a little bit of background. I'm not sure exactly who this audience is and whether it may be commonly known or not, that Persian was a very important language of the Islamic East, used by Muslims and non-Muslims alike. And from roughly, you could say, the 14th to the early 19th century, it was the language of power and learning across Central, South, and West Asia, used for such things, and of course has changed over time, as government, philosophy, Sufi literature, historical commemoration, storytelling, poetry, and ethical literature. And as a result, a heavy and continuous circulation of people, texts, practices, and ideas connected something that we may call Persianate Asia. Now that much is well outlined in scholarship. And I'm going to give you this map. And this is kind of how these regions, this region that I'm calling Persianate Asia is usually talked about as empires through the story of their political borders and their political history. This is a very kind of dominant frame. The part that I bring, that I attempted to kind of make my contribution, is what I argue that we should understand from this shared language. That this mobility sustained a shared cultural hermeneutics across these regions that could be taken up by rulers to form imperial ideologies, utilized by merchants in everyday transactions, or invoked by mendicants in their peregrinations. Persianate sensibilities had to be acquired because one was never born with them. Persians were thus a kind of person who had received a particular form of basic education that imparted the Persianate, through which they understood and engaged with the world. So we can think of Persian both as a textual corpus, but one whose encapsulated meanings also lived and circulated orally in stories and verse for broader audiences. So to kind of back up for a minute, right? The general question animating my work is what kinds of histories, meaning worlds, ties, and divisions do we see when we look beyond nationalist and regional frames to the thick and deep past connecting various parts of Asia? And here I'm locating Iran as part of West Asia. And I wanted to show this to you. This is actually the original painting where the book's cover came from. And it is it's an illustration in an early, very famous 17th century commemorative text of Akbar Padishah, the Timurid ruler of Hindustan. And it remembers the illustration is of a particular part in the narrative, which remembers how Akbar's father, Humayun, sought refuge in Safavid Iran in the mid 16th century with Shah Tahmasp, who gave him the support to get his kingdom back, basically by force of arms. And here, in this Indo-Persian text that was trans-regionally known, the two rulers of illustrious houses sit together in front of the Safavid capital of Qazvin, which is, you can kind of see it in the background here. And unfortunately got cut out for my book where they went close up. This assistance, however, came at a cost. Humayun had to bow his head to Tahmasp and take the Safavid Taj. And this episode and the relationship it created were commemorated in complementary and contestatory ways through the decades that followed all the way through the 18th century, some of which I detail in the book. So this is the map I prefer to use in my book, which I took pains to have drawn without political borders, but with cities and domains, large and small, that are discussed in the book. Now, I realize that speaking of connections across Persianate Asia runs the risk of romanticizing some kind of cosmopolitan pre-modern. But I was writing in the context of scholarship that assumed divisions, and knowing what was shared seemed essential to a truly historicized understanding of what was not. The assumed divisions that structure our knowledge live at the level of the common sense of the nation. And the nation becomes kind of figured in earlier times as the previous political kingdoms that existed on it, however uneasily. And this kind of common sense of the nation becomes a definitive category. And the other way it exists is the way knowledge is currently divided into area studies. So I'll come back to that in a moment, but the term Persianate itself has been used in a variety of ways to describe the distinct political and cultural formations and their intellectual and literary corpuses characterizing Eastern Islamic domains. So when I began my work, Persian studies was located in and bifurcated by these regional studies divisions. So the domain of Persian was part of the Iranian national subset of Middle East studies, and Persian and South Asian studies, which is usually called Indo-Persian, was treated separately, both from Persian in the Middle East and also in many ways from things called Indic, right? So although trans-regional studies are gaining prominence in their own right, these national and regional divisions are still institutionally entrenched and reflected often in separate bodies of scholarship that seldom overlap. Now, obviously, that's when I started, and new critical attention is slowly enriching this conversation, but methodological nationalism casts a long shadow that my work seeks to dispel. So even work that explicitly kind of was arguing against this way of looking still had not figured out how to speak about certain things outside of those frames. So the Persianate is also an opportunity to think through what has been outlined as an intermediate scale of analysis, somewhere between the regional and the global. And I gained a lot of inspiration from other intermediate scales that overlapped with the Persianate, like Indian Ocean studies or land-based intra-Asian studies, both of which were very, very helpful because Persians cross land and sea, right? So when I began reading Persian texts from the 18th and early 19th century, and I first started with travel texts and then other kinds of texts that I realized were related and that I began to call commemorative, I saw a disjuncture with the scholarship that existed at the time. So much of what I was reading, and again, this is over a dozen years ago, and there's been a lot of amazing work since then, but a lot of what I read still evaluated the period before the rise of colonial modernity with categories, terms, and understandings that belong to this later period. This seemed limiting to me because categories are important. And if you begin with too many assumptions, you generally find what you're looking for. And you do so at the risk of obscuring everything else that does not fit that frame and may change its meaning. And anyway, as Sheldon Pollock has pointed out, how can we know what colonialism, colonial modernity, and its forms of knowing have changed if we don't know what was there before? So the work that I started doing was in part dedicated to clearing conceptual ground to even be able to speak about what I was interested in. So Persianate Selves presents an argument about what place and origin meant for Persians across Iran and Hindustan in the 18th century between the fall of the Safavids in 1722 and when the British abolished official use of Persian in India in the 1830s. And specifically, I outline how the expansive and multiple notions of place and origin allowed for a range of possibilities of collective affiliation, out of which pre-modern Persianate selves grew. And in the course of that, I argue that Persians were possessors of the Persianate language, that they learned adab through its verses and stories, how to behave at appropriate moments with gratitude or generosity, when it was called for, and towards whom. And so here I'm defining adab in its kind of older and more expansive way as the proper form of things and of being in the world. And this concept roughly can be explained as proper aesthetic and ethical forms of thinking, acting, and speaking, and thus of perceiving, desiring, and experiencing. And I think about adab, Persianate adab, as it's kind of expressed as providing a certain coherent logic of being Persian. What was proper to one context was relational. It could be inappropriate to another context. To learn these forms, to identify their appropriate moments, and to inhabit them successfully was to be an ideal Persian. Now, not everybody was ideal, but through their longing for it, people belonged. By the 18th century, the largest number of Persian speakers lived in the South Asian subcontinent, and many of them were not Muslim. So one of the things that I thought about is the way in which Persian is a Muslim language, but it didn't have to be, nor was it always so. Islam's specificity could be universalized, allowing for affiliation with and adoption into different vernaculars and religious communities. Persian had an accumulated tradition of accommodating other knowledge systems that could be translated to resonate with its own and then become part of its corpus of universal knowledge. And so the kind of intervention that I make, and I do so very fleetingly because a lot of it is going in the next book, it's really to kind of position this idea of Persian outside of a debate that's often very bifurcated, where Persian is either incidental to the primary meaning of Islam, or else it is entirely separate as a culture and described as secular. And so I wanted to kind of make clear, and this is the kind of first instance of using adab and its logic analytically, of needing to reconceptualize the relationship in terms of aporia. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. So back to the book. So the Persianate Selves brings together works that are usually understood as separate genres, biographical compendiums or tazkeres, travelogues, histories, memoirs, and poetry under the heading of commemorative texts based on their shared imperative of commemoration, as well as common forms and features. The same overarching logic of diversity, legible as coherence, govern the range of possible conceptions of place and origin. Ultimately, I argue that multiple places and origins, a diversity understood as proper and necessary, constituted a range of Persianate collectives and their selves that crossed modern boundaries. So pre-nationalist Persians were from many lands, religions, occupations, social locations, and even genders, though these boundaries possessed aphoretic rather than categorical distinctions that require reassessment of their historical meanings. So the book is sort of divided into two parts. The central premise of section 1 of the book, Place, is that the overarching logic of modern empirical geography was only one possible mode of knowing place. because it was embedded in and continuous with other modes of knowing place that were different and even undermined empiricism, we cannot view it as definitive for that kind of period of time. So the 3 chapters in this section address the significance of different scales of place and the possible modes of placemaking, as well as the way places were invested with meaning. So in the first chapter, I outlined the flexibility and multivalence of terms, distinguishing common ways of understanding units of geographical place, such as kingdoms and provinces, from effective notions of place, such as homelands. Chapter 2 illustrates the role of commemorating the near and far past in attributing meaning to 18th century presence. And the 18th century is a kind of period that's marked by the fall of the Safavid Empire and the devolution of Timurid power in Iran and India. So it's a time of great political upheaval and reconfiguration. But different interpretations, nevertheless, of contemporary events evince similarly remarkable understandings of lands, geographies, and their relations to other places, all with reference to proper ethical forms in learning, service, rulership, social interaction, and piety. The 3rd chapter looks at the cartographic effects of meaning making and features of place that lent them a moral cast. So widely recognized features of urbanity, learning, just rule, and the storied tradition of Persian and Islamic narratives connected the universal with the local in particular. So transregionally circulating commemorations of place created a morally imbued sense of familiarity and proximity that were more significant than empirical geographic contiguity, right? The second part of the book, the sections on the section 2 on origin, examines the meaning and labor of origins among Persians between Safavid Iran and Timurid Hindustan. And I begin with a common modern assumption that a homeland in the Safavid kingdom established a primordial Proto-Iranian loyalty that marked all migrants to Hindustan, even those in Timurid imperial service. And this is very dominant in the scholarship. And we have knowledge that many people from Safavid domains went to India and entered into Timurid service. So this becomes the context in which they are discussed as kind of primordially being Iranians. So modern scholarship possesses limited conceptual means by which to understand origins outside of mutually exclusive categories that are taken to be definitive of affiliation. Place is given prominence along with things called religion, nationality, and ethnicity. But as with place, I argue that modern categories are either not definitive or else entirely inappropriate. So in chapter 4, I argue that the form of origin was lineage, multifariously constituted, and that alongside territorialized notions of origin, they were often far more important lineages, including those of service, learning, aesthetics, and practice, which call into question our understanding of meaningful connection. And the next chapter looks at pre-modern notions of social collectives, commonly called tribes or ethnicities. And I kind of dispense with these terms and historicize social collectives through the adab of their telling. And I find connection between various lineages of birth, legal status, and other formally socially regulated relationships. And the variety of lineages constituting origin requires a reconsideration of kinship that really kind of dislodges law and birth as definitive. So one of the other things that I find is that these understandings of origin and lineages defy modern categories like nation, ethnicity, and tribe, and really kind of require a reconsideration of relationships outside of anachronistic notions of blood or biological truth. So the last chapter looks at different ways in which naming captured the possibilities of affiliation. And in particular, I elaborate on the regionally specific ways in which Persians called themselves and each other, and how transregional circulation accommodated such specificities in the lineaments of the universal. So names of both individuals and collectives linked people to groups and to each other in ways that were relational, contextual, and thus belie the discrete mutual exclusivity of modern categorization. So this is actually, in some ways, in order to understand this, it's a challenge to our way of thinking by which something gains clarity and precision through not being the same as something else. And this is what I mean by aporia, right? And in most studies of early modern or pre-modern contexts, the discussion is always about how categories are fluid, but they're not fluid. They just have a different logic that we have yet to really fully grasp. So changing political and economic factors in the 18th century challenged social connections and collective affiliation, raising the stakes for commemoration for societies facing fracture and reconstitution in both Iran and Hindustan. So the last chapter focuses on this particular context, but also on Tazkere writing in the aftermath of imperial devolution, focusing on the insight they offer into possibilities for articulating collectives and selves. And I specifically look at poetic Tazkeres, which commemorate aesthetically and socially constituted collectives of Persians. And these included past and contemporary poets as part of an imagined community of ancestors and peers in which were nested networks of social relationships. And the sheer number and diversity of such texts enunciate the many possible ways these collectives could be imagined and their selves brought into being. So ultimately, this was a Persian who could be affiliated with a multiplicity of places and have diverse origins that little resembled those demanded by nationalism. So the kind of purpose of this work and the way that I saw it was to make a claim for what it meant to be Persian before nationalism, but also thinking very much with the violence and exclusions of modern nationalist politics in mind and the limitations of its forms of knowing. And I really felt that we cannot find our way out of the conundrums of the present by only looking within modern limits. And I wanted to look at an earlier time when ways of seeing and being in the world were different, not to return to them, but as a site of learning, which could act as a kind of source of inspiration for imagining new futures. And in terms of method, very plainly, I read closely, attending to what the sources try to show me, right? Things like implied audience, concerns shaping the text, its stakes of meaning, and the connections and disjunctures with other texts, other forms of writing and bodies of knowledge that they establish. I also ask what my sources show me that perhaps they did not mean to, either because what I see is implied and presumed, they don't need to explain it, because they are so widely known that explicit iteration is unnecessary, or maybe I see it as a result of my rootedness in time and place. So what my sources showed me was the hermeneutical ground, the ways of seeing, understanding, experiencing, and representing the world and being in it. And I wanted to connect with that hermeneutical ground, but through an approach and a relation different from modern historical practices, right? Modern scholarly practices, which are birthed in an era of European colonial domination and its attendant racisms. And this gave us Orientalism, for instance, as a certain kind of relation of power and knowledge. And my inspiration was a body of scholarship, both post-colonial and feminist, that problematized the normative position of the historian as a masculinist one who mastered and dominated his subject into an object of knowing. This position had taught us to treat our sources as dead letters, where the subjectivity of the modern scholar was both dominant in terms of engagement, but also absent as a term of interrogation. What if I brought myself back in, not as a self-expose, so much as an acknowledgement of myself as a particularly formed and positioned modern speaker seeking to understand? What if we moderns approached our sources as they asked their audience to, as texts of commemoration, of remembering together? What if we took their concerns with ethical being and moral substance seriously? What if I took adab and its logic as an analytic framework rather than an object by which I could articulate my mastery of Persian cultural history? What if I attempted to learn from it and be transformed by it? So I consider the book a beginning, an opening, an invitation, rather than a definitive last word. This book actually began as a manuscript, twice its size, and the rest of it has kind of been relegated to a second project that will flesh out adab and mobility, its breadth and its depth, its social and political forms across the Persianate as a world both material and imaginary. And in the meanwhile, I rely on more recent scholarship taking up similar concerns, such as that of my hosts, or that drill down deeper into more regional and local parts of the Persianate and its traditions and interactions. I think of this work, this other work, engaged with my own as part of a necessary dialogue, a majlis, if you will, of Persianate studies and perhaps a transformed Iranian studies in the process. So I'll stop there. Thank you. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you, Mana, especially the final punch about close reading and communicating with the dad through their texts, in a sense, is giving them some subjectivity of their own and ways. We need to continue searching for ways to reach those voices. I will start with some reflections on the text, and it was a great pleasure reading this book. I'm thankful to you for its style, composition, and it is really a fluid reading experience. Of course, as an Ottomanist, I have many issues with the first part of the title, which I would like to open up. I know you faced this question too many times, but I may bring in some new perspective to the use of Persianate. We will see. It is one of those words I really liked in the book, your kind of critical approach to early modern for its teleological and essentializing attitude towards the modern. And Shahab Ahmed has criticized Persianate in his book for it assumptively, he says, privileges linguistic and ethnic elements. And also, I think they're kind of trying to reach to understand what was there before colonialism. Was there a sense of Persianate? I would like to hear from you more about using the vocabulary to discover those voices before the colonial rupture, which is, I think you do masterfully in this text. The text gave me a sense that there are two major layers. One was theoretical and one was historical, and they're perfectly intertwined. On the one hand, there is the commemoration, first adab as a vehicle of memory, adab, the whole technology of a certain manner, production system, etc. And then commemoration as a technology of establishing selves through particular texts, which used to be translated as biographical dictionaries, for example, tezkires, which in fact talk about tezkir, reminders, enforcers to repeat something, that tezkir is such a rich word in its as a form. And this theoretical part draws on, a European continental philosophy in US, like Ian Butler, Derrida. They you really engage productively with them, not like name dropping. The way you use aporia is really inspiring for me. for example. And second layer is the 18th century proliferation of those commemorative texts after the fall of the Safavids in 1720s, and then before just British ban Persian in India. Yeah, so these two layers were really interesting to me, because with the first layer, this commemoration sounded to me almost like a theory of selfhood, almost an ethnography done through research on a particular textual community, like social collectives, in a particular period and space, through a historical transformative period. But all periods are transformative this way or that way. But I mean, you know what I mean. I try to mean, like, kind of. But in a sense, my question is like this commemoration part. Sometimes I felt during my reading, I may be mistaken, that like, is it happening only here and now? Is it like explanatory about the 18th century happenings? May there be other reasons behind the proliferation of tezkires? Because commemoration is such a human, such a species specific act, as far as we can know, and it happened like such different genres, oral and written textuality is always like, I found it really illuminating to think even modern literature from this angle, like how novels refer to each other, and you know, like a longing for a certain self and making of a self, and a modern adapt came to my mind. Is it possible to kind of look into our lives after the colonial rupture, let's say, through this lens? So I found the theoretical chapter very promising to think further beyond the 18th century and beyond the Persianate or Indo-Persian sphere, kind of a thing. Because when I think about it in 16th century, when the Ottoman states was kind of taking a certain shape, of course states continue taking different shapes, but I mean, never to become absolute, always open to the whims of history. But when the Ottoman Empire was really becoming classical, what they called, we see a proliferation of commemorative texts like tezkires start during the mid 16th century. Really, they take up, and they are still longing for it, like not maybe longing, but they have this posturing of a room identity, which kind of compares it with Ajam, like Shuarai Rum versus Shuarai Ajam. And I wonder like how it happens with Urdu in a later time, like, but this posturing, in fact, I feel like, again, coming back to Persianate, I see their problem, like trying to incorporate at least Ottomans, even though I see all the reasons. They were reading Golistan, they were reading Masnavi, they were reading Persian classics, but they were also reading Arabic and other languages. And also in the Ottoman sphere, they had like, they were shoulder to shoulder different social collectives like Armenian, Greek, this Anatolian multilingualism is very different from Indo-Iranian multilingualism, at least to some degree. It must be different spatial difference, temporal difference. So I think like, what would be the consequences of using a more spatial term? And I am seriously, I don't think like, I really appreciated the whole book as is, but I'm just trying to think, is it maybe better to use a more spatial term? Because in the origins section, which I appreciated a lot, these lineages in a sense takes people out of the space, and sometimes we may get confused because they talk about their mentors or assumed ancestors without giving the place names, like sometimes, and then they are suddenly in this vacuum of a lineage, identifying themselves as such. But still, at least Ottomans called them Rum, people of Rum, even though it had many issues, like problems about it, Romans kind of a thing. But was it possible to use Ajam instead of Persianate Selves? Um, and finally, like, I mean, if you can, like, I really think what you think about this theoretical issue becoming more really a theoretical lens that is very innovative in understanding literary, especially literary production, what we call literary thinking, which enabled their actors to speak truth to the power, in a sense, as a part of a textual community, because, you know, they were elite, but they were not necessarily powerful in their individuality. They were subject to the power of this elite structure, just like sultans were, just like the viziers were, just like the scribes were, like this kind of a conceptualization. I will stop here. These are both reflections, and I will appreciate whatever you say. Like, I am thankful to you for writing Persianate Selves for us.
Should I? Okay. So I appreciate all of these comments, and I would love to hear more about what you think the problem for this is in the Ottoman context, because obviously that's not something I really deal with. And it was partly a reaction to the fact that people who are looking do look in that way, because it's all Middle East studies, Iran and the Ottoman Empire, right? I do know that there are other scholars that are thinking about this, and it's very important to think about. And with the question of Rum, right, I actually don't think that the arguments I make are against what you're saying, because Rum, right, means Rome, literally, and spatially, it has that same kind of relational, multifarious levels of meaning, right? It can mean all of the domain of the Ottoman, under Ottoman rule. That's what, right, the people of Rum refers to, but it's also this kind of Anatolia and across the water area that is smaller, right? And it heralds back to a particular history that the place has accrued. And so I guess the reason I don't use something like Ajam is because while Ajam might be used in particular contexts, in many other contexts, it's not, right? Why is Ajam more definitive than Tajik, right? Which is kind of much more dominant as a term in Central Asia. And I think a lot of it, sometimes the same person will use a different way to refer to Persian speakers, depending on who he's face to face with or in comparison with. And what I wanted to try and do was to build up the concept of Persianate, for which there is no Persian equivalent, right? It's a neologism. It's a way to have a term that indicates something besides Iranian. To think about, to be able to hold this different way of understanding one's relationship to people. So the same person that vis-a-vis an Ottoman person may be Ajam, right? Will travel to another place and be a Tajik. And I wanted to keep that, that aporia. And to think of a term that didn't have all of these associations of modern exclusivity, right? Where they don't turn into somebody that can only be connected to another set of identities with a hyphen, which is the kind of the reason why, someone is Armenian Iranian. They're because Iranian actually presumes a certain set of borders and a certain set of things with which it is mutually exclusive with, right? So that was my thinking of that. And the consequence of using a spatial term, part of it is also that our modern thinking is so connected to and gender works this way, right? The physical and the material and the physiological become proof of something. And I think geography works in the same way when thinking about place, right? And what I wanted to be able to do was bring something much more malleable and a much more malleable way of imagining place, right? It really struck me the moment I started really thinking about the way that travel is measured, right? The farsakh, right? The farsakh is not a measurement of empirical space. It's the time, right? And it's about more or less, they say, oh, it's 6 kilometers, right? It's the amount of space that you can travel in a particular unit of time. But obviously, that's going to vary wildly, right? And I realized that this was something that we hadn't really acknowledged and come to terms with. So that's one thing. The other thing about commemoration, and I appreciate all of your thoughts. I think that, I can talk about taskeres, but what I wanted to do was to look at how, taskeres are a very obvious type of commemorative text because of the title. And it is also a genre that really proliferates in the 18th century in a way that we don't see beforehand, at least in Iran and India. There are previous taskeres, and we know, for instance, that different kinds of tarikh texts had taskeres in the back, like little taskere sections. So it's also not a kind of hermetic form of writing. There is also a way in which I found things that sounded a lot like taskeres when people, were writing kind of memoir or travel texts, where they said, and in this place, I met these people. These are all of the men of literature, and they would enumerate and commemorate people in a way that wasn't significantly different than the way taskeres do. But what I found is that there is a relationship between a number of different texts that we separate generically as chronicles, right? And travel logs and memoirs or autobiographical texts or biographical dictionaries. But when I started looking at tarikh, for instance, and texts that call themselves names even, I found that the evocation of memory, yad and yadagari, zikr, these sorts of things were so important in the framing of the text. And they also remembered people similarly in ways that I thought this seemed like something to pay attention to and to put in these texts in conversation with one another. And so I obviously agree that people didn't just start commemorating in the 18th century. But I do think that there is a way, because of the proliferation of taskeres, you can see very clearly the kind of labor that commemoration could perform, right? And to me, that was very interesting because you have certain kinds of commemorative texts that are produced at the beginning of, across the 16th century, as these empires are establishing themselves and articulating certain aspects of what they mean in particular ways. But the 18th century is very interesting because it's kind of a moment where things are falling apart. And things are falling apart and they're reconstituting, but in very tentative and different ways, right? And so one of the things we've talked about is both decentralization of previous larger empires, but also, attempts to kind of not just decentralization, but reconfiguration according to the same forms, right? Which is one of the ways in which newness entered the world in pre-modern contexts, right? They didn't present themselves as ruptures, right? That's the adab of modernity. And so one of the things that was very interesting is the way in which you could see, and we have scholarship, for instance, on historical scholarship on the 18th century that says, yes, all of these things happened, populations shifted around, but certain things at the local level were actually quite stable. And it's in these contexts that you see these massive proliferations of commemorative texts. And the question, I felt that there was a kind of preservation and a moral impetus in response to the kinds of contexts, right? They became a way to preserve a certain kind of local collective or community. And it also became a way to articulate a kind of new configuration. And so, one of the things that you see also is the way in which, especially towards the end of the 18th and early 19th century, this continues in Iran and India, the production of tazkeras for the establishment of new entities and collectives. And Kevin Schwartz has written about this, for instance, in the context of the early 19th century in regional kingdoms there. One of the most kind of interesting moments is when this happens, for instance, in Hyderabad. And there's a movement to kind of produce these tazkeras. And the question becomes why? What is being commemorated? It also became interesting to me that all of a sudden, and I think this is one of the ways in which it's a bit different from earlier practices, although if you bring poetry into it, a lot of things are being remembered, right? But with tazkeras, you start to have people that know each other and are writing in the same city, producing multiple tazkeras, sometimes simultaneously, right? And that was the question I tried to frame that chapter around, which is why? It definitely makes it so that we can't read them as biographical dictionaries, right? They're not reference texts because these people knew they were writing. And so the question becomes, there is a kind of space where there isn't also complete agreement, right? And there is a kind of moment where people have different visions, but this isn't a huge problem, right? They're not bad-mouthing each other. They don't see themselves as competitors. And I thought this was very interesting too. And they reference each other's texts. And so there is a way in which I was able to see both explicitly in practice as well as in the articulation of a certain kind of multiplicity, which was expected and even celebrated. And I thought that was very interesting because, if we think about our own kinds of cultural wars, that tends to be less the case, right? So maybe I will stop there and hear what Adia has to say.
Thank you. Thank you, Mona, for that very thought-provoking, for writing a provocative and argumentative book and for your thoughtful answers. I really want to give priority to the audience. I know they have a lot of questions to ask you, so I will limit all the questions I want to ask you to just one. And because I have to be selfish as somebody coming to your work from the late 19th to, and early 20th centuries, I'm going to ask a question that's marginal to the book, a question that falls outside the purview of the book, but it is something that you and I have been in dialogue about because I know you are deeply curious about what happens in the 20th century, and it also provides a point of contrast for the book. I think generally speaking, the book paints this world, right, in which the dominant discourse sides with becoming, not with being. It's a world of acquisition of homeland, of lineage, of language, of the creation of aesthetic norms, sensibilities that are not native to any one territory and to any people, right? And then the backdrop of that is this homogenizing singular shadow of nationalism that disturbs and displaces these sensibilities, patterns of cultural interaction that were formed for centuries, right? And so in many ways, the pre-modern, how cartoonishly, of course, we take the category to be, which you do a great job of critiquing that. But the pre-modern is one of routes in your study, and the modern world is one of roots. But I feel like in my reading of texts that are summoned as participants in the creation of ontological nationalism, people like Muhammad Hossein Foroughi, people like Muhammad Taqi Bahar, people like Qari Abdullah in Afghanistan, I feel like they can be read in ways that are actually not at all dissimilar to the way you read very carefully your corpus of text. I think that a lot of what you attribute to nationalism is a very certain type of nationalism that gets codified and institutionalized in the latter part of the 20th century. I would even say in the perhaps third quarter, if not the fourth quarter of the 20th century. And one of the things I loved about your book is that it reminded me of Objects of Translation of Finbar Flood, in the sense that this is a book there's an absence of empires, because I'm personally sick of books about the Safavids and the Timurids of India and whatnot. And you've written a book where they're in the background, they're muted. And it's about the circulation of text and the world that these people inhabit, these people that you call Persian inhabit. I feel like a similar story can be told about the first part of the 20th century, one in which the nation state is there, and there are multiple ways that people are trying to create an adab of that would help this unit of belonging in very different ways. But there are also ways Persian is being deployed in ways that do not adhere to a singular national logic. And so again, this to me is not a problem in the book. Your job is not to give us a nuanced, complex narrative about nationalism. Your job is to recover a lost literacy with which people would read those texts. I just put that out there to get your reaction.
Thank you. And I fully agree with you. And I try to make it clear that even now it's not fully complete, right? I mean, if we're going to be talking about there's no resistance or way of seeing other things, I mean, I always wondered this about Foucault, and it's like, well, then how are you writing? Right? But I honestly think, I mean, and this is what I tried to talk about in the coda at the end, right? Where, I had been thinking about all of these ideas of mamlakat and how mamlakat is a small place or a large place, and it's very kind of contextually determined. And then I go to Yazd with my father, and he introduces me to this old family acquaintance in the bazaar. And this man, after hearing that I've come from Tehran, says, خوش آمدید به مملکت یزد, and I was like, wow. And I realized that it's right there. It's still there, right? Its overarching logic has been disrupted. And I think you're absolutely right that this was not necessarily, I mean, that's why I also kind of question the idea of colonial modernity as the rupture it's made out to be, right? There are memories that are lost, and that there are those that are lingering. And the spaces in which they have to connect with each other and circulate have certainly changed. Right. But I think you're absolutely right. And that's what I tried to deal with actually in the article that you mentioned, right? The special issue on After the Persianate. When Afshin and I kind of wrote that, one of the things I tried to think is to how far could I push that logic? And when I looked at the late 19th century, reformist literature, I found that many memories were still there, including a certain idea of self that was not constituted in distinction to an other, that was radically ulterior, right? It was in conversation and dialogue with the beloved friend, right? And this was the continuation of an older idea. And a lot of the ideas about adab and akhlaq and ayn and ras, these were definitely the language that a lot of the reformists, and that's something I talk about in the Civilizing Emotions book, right? That continues, those ideas continue. They do become reframed and connected to other things in different ways. But I definitely didn't want to reinscribe a very modern, mutually exclusive categorization temporally either. I do think, however, that what you describe, right, that it took until most of the way through the 20th century for these things to become quite dominant. The fact is that they are quite dominant now, And it becomes, even when scholars are trying to argue that we shouldn't think about things this way, there isn't, our language has shrunk, right? And that's the difficulty of pulling the frame out. If we don't have a language to talk about it, if we don't have a set of understandings to kind of explore and build with, then it becomes very, very hard, right? And then you just end up finding Iranians everywhere. And there's no critical distance that gets inserted between, Pahlavi era Iranians and the Safavid ones. And Iran becomes some kind of timeless thing that has existed exactly as it is now, through time immemorial. So that was the kind of thinking behind it. But you're absolutely right. And it's very helpful to have the work that shows, because I'm always afraid to go back into the 20th century. I stopped at the end of the 19th. I was like, okay, that's far enough.
I think it's time that we give the floor back to Mindy, and we'll have questions and answers. Thank you, Mona.
Thank you very much. Those were great comments.
Okay, so we're going to go in order of who has raised their hand / who has written comments. So the first one is Domenico. Thank you so much for your insightful talk. They are intrigued with how you conceive the Persian itself as a post-ethnic cultural identity. They are wondering, how does this category apply to contexts in which local discourses about identity frame selfhood in ways that do not connect with the Persianate in an explicit and emic fashion? Would you define Ottoman poets composing ghazal in Persian as Persians?
That's a great question. And that's probably something that someone like Selim could probably answer way better than me. I mean, my answer would be maybe, but I don't know. That would be a really interesting question to ask, and to think about the ways in which if we think about Persian as, let me also say something else. I am not fully convinced that we can say that pre-modern people had identities in the modern sense, right? If we are supposed to take seriously the scholarship and thought on what constituted modernity, especially the way in which it produces a certain kind of interiorized self, and the array of disciplines such as psychology, right? Such as ways of understanding that are very specific to modernity. Did people identify and have affiliations, or did they always have identities? This seems very ahistorical to me. And I have the same kind of problem with it that I have with the concept of ethnicity, which supposedly in an unchanging way exists in all times and places as a category. And we just have to go and find the different ways it was configured in different times and places. And so my question would be, if we can take Persian and Persianate to be something that is really is about a different way of identification or affiliation, then that's what I would think about as a Persian or Persianate. And I don't know the answer to the question about Ottomans, but I do think that in other contexts, and this is something Selim brought up about multilingualism. I mean, India has an incredible array of multilingual contexts, and Francesco Orsini has done amazing work in thinking about how this would work together. But I think that, there is a very long tradition of thinking about translation and mutual resonance with certain kinds of both local forms of knowledge, other knowledge traditions, and sort of linguistic forms that for a long time, that's something that from the beginning was part of New Persian, and definitely as it circulated. And I'm not sure about the relationship specifically with Ottoman Turkish, but I do know that the means of bringing in other words, other forms, other ideas, other histories, right? And here I'm thinking about the way in which the Mongol tradition becomes adapted into Persian. right? And the Timurids are very much part of it. It happens over a long period of time. This is, in fact, something that's very, very important for understanding something about which much has been made, which is the way in which the Timurids in India begin to engage with Indic forms of knowledge, right? That a certain kind of practice and tradition of doing that already existed, right? Where you can read in Rashiduddin, for instance, that Oghoz Khan, one of the ancestors of the Mongols, was the Jamshid of the Turks, right? So for me, that's a practice of translation and mutual resonance, right? And he's also given a kind of representation in his life story that also resonates with a prophetic tradition. And he has a lot of the features and characteristics of Jesus in the Quranic tradition. And so these is that Persianate? Maybe, I think so.
Okay, thank you for your answer. Now we're going to turn it over to Purnima.
Hi, Mana. I get so much every time I talk to you about this book. I just want to kind of put together a few themes that came up as you were talking to our previous speakers. It seems to me that what you're getting at here is a matter of also historicizing what I would call scale and institutionalizing. In other words, in the 18th century, as empires are no longer as productive or generative of those kinds of opportunities that created institutional settings for where this kind of adabiyat could be spread, reformed, rechanged. It's spilling over, if we look at Walter Hakla works, your own work, Kevin Schwartz's work, into the bazaar, into the maktab, into the coffee houses and taverns. In what way can we say then that there are perhaps new spaces where these encounters are happening with a kind of more formalization and institutionalization of the rules into how you get access to becoming Persian? And is the 18th century different, or is it just a matter of the fact that the scale of these encounters is now becoming much more bigger, more expansive geographically, and in terms of the numbers of people it is involving, right? So these people can then be reframed as, Ahl-e-Zaq, people of taste, Ahl-e-Kalam, people of the pen, Ahl-e-Ruh, right, people of spirit. It seems to me that one of the things we haven't talked about is why perhaps scale matters to this question, which might also help then explain the persistence of some of these forms into the 19th and 20th century.
Thank you. That's, I mean, I guess my question is, one of the things that we have a really, this gets to something that we're still really very much working out, which is in a pre-modern context, right? We have ways of talking about it in a modern context, but in a pre-modern context, what is the relationship between culture and politics, right? And this is something that I feel like a lot of the scholarship that I look at has attention to. So there's the state-making processes, right? And I know that in the Ottoman context, there's a lot of emphasis on the state, right? There are state-making processes, but what does this mean before the modern Foucauldian state, right? And this is something that I thought about when I was thinking about the way that, for instance, even the early 19th century, Fath Ali Shah's court is producing a number of taskeras that are really kind of seeking to Iranianize Persian. Does this mean that that's what everyone was thinking and doing? Does the early Qajar state have that kind of power? I also am not sure sometimes about when we're talking about institutionalization, what we mean, right? What is a pre-modern institution? And one of the kind of most startling translations for me of this is Ain Akbaris becomes, the institutes or it becomes read as a kind of statement of the Mughal state as an institution. And I found that very weird. And I definitely think that something is happening in the 18th century, but in a major way, it is a product of what has gone on in the previous centuries of empire building, right? But at the same time, we know that the Mughals, the Timurids, don't bring Persian to the subcontinent. They deploy it in particular ways, and they bring a certain set of intellectual lineages with them, right? I also think that this idea that Persian becomes, I mean, something very specific is going on in the context of India, but the fact that it's percolating down into other sectors of society, I mean, we see this happening in 15th and 16th century Central Asia, right? And there are tasketas, the earliest tasketas are filled with craftsmen who are composing poetry, for instance. And so what are we supposed to make of that, right? And this goes back to the question that Salim raised about historical periodization, right? And the limits of historical knowledge, which really want to make something new. And it really has to, you know, there has to be something defining and distinctive, and it has to have not happened before. And so for me, this, I do think that historicizing is important, but I feel like it's not necessarily, it's very hard to draw boundaries around it, to make something specific. I do think the question of scale is helpful, but I found it to be more helpful to think about regions and locality and those specificities as they relate to larger scales of things happening. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I do agree that in the 18th century, you definitely see new spaces of formalization and a multiplication of them, and a set of contestations and struggles around them, right? I mean, one of the big things that you and I both know about is that there was an incredible struggle over proper form, proper poetic form taking place at this time in India. And it's something that carried over into the context of Urdu or Rikhta. And so, you know, I don't think that the kind of social devolution of the spread and practice of Persian was separate from these kinds of struggle over aesthetics, right? Sorry, I don't know if that fully satisfies what you were looking for.
Thank you so much for your question, Parama, and thank you so much for your answer, Mana. We're going to turn now to the Q&A section, a written question by James. If there was a lesson into 2020, it was that we ignore nature at our peril. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on the natural world and how we can better incorporate the material into understanding identity. Place, for example, is often expressed in geographical writing through production, exchange, trade networks, taxation, administration, outward connections. What does that environmental focus tell us about identity?
I'm reading this question and thinking about it. I mean, I guess I prefer to use the material to the natural, because I actually think that you know, this is one of those kind of unexamined things, right? The concept of the natural world is a historical construct, right? What is nature? What is culture? I mean, this goes back into a whole bunch of things. So yes, we have a particular idea of what the natural world is. Is there a similar idea in the context we're looking at? And I think we have to kind of start by asking ourselves that, right? Is there something called nature? And is it, I do think environment, right? Which, I mean, what do you mean by environment? Is it ab and hava? And the way in which an environment, right, in a context, in a kind of pre-modern Persianate context, ab and hava is very important, partly because the people inhabiting that environment, right, live in what is understood to be a porous body. And it's a humoral body, it's a porous body. And so, one of the things I talk about, for instance, which I found very interesting, is the way that conducting yourself according to proper adab could protect you from the effects of different lands that you were in, that by their nature were seen to have bad effects on you. Right. And so there is a way in which the human body was understood to be porous, made up of humors that had to be kept in a balance, and environments, and Abba Hava weren't the only thing, right? It's also about food and eating practices and what you put in your body, but also the company you keep, right? Which it in a lot of ways is also about the environment. So I take what you're saying as important. And I definitely think that the material world and the practice of it are very important. And this is something that I try to get into, actually, of the many chapters I had to cut out because nobody will publish a first book past a certain word limit. I actually have a set of chapters where I think about the relationship between the material and the imaginary. And I try to think through this question of trade networks and sort of the material experience of circulation and mobility, and what it might mean for the greater focus that I put in this book on the imaginary. And I try and take the imaginary and extend it, right? So for instance, what happened when somebody landed in a particular place, and they realized that, things they weren't quite the way that, they had read about in the text or the poems, right? So these are things that I think are very interesting, but I also think we have to be careful about assuming that we know what the natural world is.
Thank you, James, for your question now and your answer, Mana. Let's now turn to Anna's question.
Hi, Dr. Kian. Thank you so much for your talk and for your book. It was a pleasure to read it and to hear you speak. I'm very interested in the part of your book that nudges us towards imagining and sounding out the present and the future through the lens of the reframed Persianate past that you put forth. You mentioned in the introduction that past Persianate meanings about selfhood, place, and origin can allow us to envision a future outside of the heritage of European colonial modernity and to decolonize ourselves. What are some of the ways that you think we can use the concepts that you center in this book, like aporia, relational kinship, or adab, in the context of Persian studies, contemporary world literature studies, or just academia in general, to bring forth a decolonial future from what you call in the conclusion, you call it our impoverished present. And then I also was kind of wondering, in what specific ways is our present impoverished? Does enriching the present for us necessitate a move away from nationalism, or is national identity now an essential part of the kaleidoscope, that beautiful metaphor that you invoke a number of times in the book, that is national identity now an essential part of the kaleidoscope of meaning for our contemporary selves? And thank you so much.
Thank you for your question. That's a very kind of careful reading of some of the points that I tried to make. I'm not sure if I can do your question justice, because I'm not sure how some of what I talk about is understood in a number of the different kind of contexts. I don't know how I could see it. I think it's for other people to think about how it could percolate outward. I mean, let me say this. So first of all, I'm a big believer in having in cultivating one's imagination. And my own, sure, I read Derrida and Butler and all of that stuff. But I actually came to them after I had already started to see something that I couldn't figure out how to put into words and I needed help with. And the one of the things that I have read, and I'm going to give you full disclosure now, fairly regularly for the last 2 decades is speculative fiction and poetry. And that gives you, for me, it's been something that has been incredible for generating imagination and other ways of seeing things. And I firmly believe that it was much more influential in my ability to read my sources with different eyes. And for me, what I tend to see and what I understood as the impoverishment of the present, I mean, it comes out of some of the vignettes I tried to speak about when I encountered growing up a very virulent kind of nationalism that was articulated in a very offhanded way. And thinking about the way in which this inscribed alterity, denigration, exclusion, and then going and reading 20th century Iranian history. And, you know, the most, I think, poignant example for me is the fate of Azeris and Azadi as a language in 20th century Iran, and the level of suppression that and the sense of threat. And this idea, and, you know, and you look further in the post-colonial world and you see, and we have all of this scholarship that talks about the ways in which nationalist understandings are so beholden to colonial categories and forms of knowledge. And you can really see it. One of the things that struck me, I remember, is reading about the decolonization of Africa, for instance. And you can even look at India and the way in which very soon after, you know, these intense struggles for self-determination, places exploded into civil war. And part of this happened over questions of who is the nation for? What language, what religion, what ethnicity, right? And for me, I thought, well, how it, you know, and so much of the post-colonial scholarship that I read, which, you know, is very inspirational, very important. And I'm thinking of, I'm probably leaving things out, but, you know, most recently I read Dipesh Chakrabarty's Provincializing Europe Again. I was looking at Ranajit Guha's History at the Limit of World History. And they're looking for ways out but staying within the modern, right? And I thought, well, there is a kind of moment where things were different. And really what I see is the potential to think past yet another way of thinking that relies on mutually exclusive categories, right? Where the binary is definitional and definitive, right? Which then, no matter how you fill it out, inscribes an exclusion. And so for me, I thought, well, actually, what we need some epistemological alternatives in ways of thinking and constituting ourselves and our relationships with others, right? And what other actually means. And so that was the kind of at the vaguest level what I was thinking about. And so how it may be, you know, especially thinking even within living memory of what it might mean to possess a certain kind of multiplicity and to be comfortable with it. And to not have it be some European idea of cosmopolitanism, which we all know is deeply problematic and predicated on a certain kind of exertion of power anyway.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Mana. Let's turn to Nicole's question as our final question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Professor Kia. Thank you so much for speaking with us and for your book, which was just very thoughtful and at times really moving. So my question, I don't know if I'm kind of asking this the right way, but one thing that I was wondering is like what a concept like diaspora might mean in your work, like in this Persianate world that you're envisioning. Because like some scholars have talked about like an Iranian diaspora in India or an Afghan diaspora in India in the pre-modern period. And I don't know a lot about kind of the major theorists of diaspora, but I feel like it carries this idea of kind of a community who is formed around a homeland. They leave that homeland, and kind of in the spaces in which they find themselves, they feel a sense of difference, sometimes isolation. So I was just wondering, yeah, like how that might fit. I don't think that you use the word diaspora at all to talk about any of the collectives that you were describing. So yeah, like if it just doesn't work in this world that you're imagining, or if it's maybe just like one way or one kind of collective that one can belong to, if that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for your question. So without getting into all of the discussions around diaspora, it is a concept that makes a series of assumptions that I'm kind of trying to move away from, right? Who's the originary diaspora? If you know, it's the Jews.
Right.
It's diaspora with a capital D. And so this makes a whole set of assumptions about homeland, return, and again, the sense of difference, right? And a certain sense of already constituted cohesiveness and boundaries. And I guess for me, that's also one of the things I thought about when I was trying to decenter or put a little bit of critical distance. I mean, I really started out with the question, so we know that there are tons of people that go from Iran to India, and and I found Iranian people from Iran everywhere, right? I mean, there's I have some that are hanging out in Aden and Yemen, Southeast Asia, all over the place. Not to mention circulating sort of in Central Asia, in the Ottoman Empire. But the question is their homeland Iran before the 19th century? And because I started reading and realizing that people are not talking about my homeland, Vatanam Iran. Nobody's saying that. Right? So the question becomes, what are we supposed to make of the fact that homelands are these smaller places? Now, obviously, places mean something to people, and different scales of places mean different things to people. And it's not that anything past the village that you grew up in, whether it's a town or a city or a village, it's not, that is definitely very important. And that's usually the Vatan, right? And it doesn't mean that larger spaces like the smaller mamlakat or even the kingdom as a whole is a kind of isn't something that one affiliated with. It's definitely the case. But whether we can flatten it all out to homeland and that kind of primordial, definitive, overarching affiliation that trumps everything else, I don't think we can do. So that's really why, and I feel like diaspora tends to really kind of privilege an understanding between land and identity. And again, this identity thing, which also functions in a definitive way, right? It tells the truth of somebody's substance somehow. I think that's why an Iranian diaspora seems a bit weird to me, definitely before a certain period of time.
Thank you so much, Nicole and Mana. Now we're just going to go around and thank you for this presentation and answering all these questions.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure and an honor.
Thank you, Mana. This was quite effective. Thank you.
I'm so sorry to members of the audience that were for whom we didn't have time. I apologize. Write to us And I look forward to seeing all of you in the future. Mana, this was a very rich conversation. I really appreciate it.
Inshallah, see you soon.
I hope so. I hope
Inshallah.
Thank you everyone for coming.